Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm your moderator, Charlene O'Hanlon, and I welcome you to today's event. We have a great webinar on tap, as always, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be able to access it on demand. Following the webinar, we'll be sending out an email with a link to the webinar that you can access it whenever you want to. And we'll also be taking questions from the audience today. So if you have a question for either of our panelists, please don't wait. Go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and we'll take probably about 10 minutes or so near the end of the webinar to go over those audience questions. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar, which is DevOps Succeed by Planning for Failures. Our speakers today are James Moore, who is Principal Offering Manager at IBM, and then you see my lovely face, haha, and then James Hunter, who's Program Director at IBM. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Charlene.
Great. Well, James Hunter, I know you're going to get us started, so I will turn it over to you and let you do
it. Thank you, Charlene.
Looks like we just lost your screen there.
Yeah, you said before the call that Microsoft might crash, and it's just crashed.
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that.
That could have been planned, James, because yes. the whole point is planning for failure, right?
There you go. I like that. I like that.
So it's almost fortuitous, a fortuitous failure.
Do you need us to run it on our side, James?
Hang on one moment.
Okay.
Rebooting that.
Yeah. Yeah, for some reason, DevOps, or sorry, not DevOps, GoToWebinar and Microsoft PowerPoint are not playing very well together these days. So I'm not quite sure what the problem is, but it's always a challenge. I'll queue it up on my side, though. If it happens again, then I can go ahead and run the slides for you.
Okay, we'll give it a go. Thanks,
all right, no problem.
Okay, so a great demonstration of getting success from planning for failure, as James rightly says. So thank you so much for that. And that's really why we want to have this particular webinar, what we want to talk about today. So I was thinking about, how do we manage this presentation? And we did have a chat earlier on about what happens if something goes wrong. What do we switch to? What do we do? We thought about the problems that could cause a failure in this, and we're going to make sure that it's a success. So the reboot worked. Our plan, our backup plans worked, and we're able to respond and get that going. But you know what? It's not just about IT. I've just come back from holiday. I came back from holiday a week ago or so, and I'm pleased to say that was also a success. I've got 2 young boys, and so anybody who's got 2 boys will know that the only way you can have a successful holiday is to prepare for failure in a similar way. So I was packing swimming trunks, things like that, so we can get on with our adventures and have fun as quickly as possible. My wife thought about how do we avoid failure and packed sun cream and plasters to fix the problems when people get scratched and bruised and hurt and that sort of thing, if anything goes wrong. But it was because of that planning that we're able to have a successful holiday. And that principle applies to everything. It applies to the applications that we run in business. And there's lots of examples around where the success of an application or a service being provided could be affected by not planning for failure, by not planning for how they're going to identify and resolve problems when things go wrong when we're live. So that's what this webinar is all about. The effectiveness of an organization's ability to enable a DevOps approach can affect the bottom line of a business. And so that's why we're talking about how to succeed by planning for failure. So there's a lot of focus around the build part of applications and software as well, because without the there's no service. If there's no software development, there's nothing to deploy. There's nothing to actually sell and take out to the market, of course. So that's where the majority of focus goes, on the development, the deploy, the operate activities. The businesses that we work for, the demanding speed, and it's easy for IT organizations and for the business just to focus on the speed of delivery by looking at each of these tasks, the activities being focused on, in isolation. But of course, success rarely comes just by focusing on the activities, whether it's swimming or whether it's coding, whether it's just managing the operation. It comes from the ability of the different parts of both the IT and the business being able to collaborate about the requirements for the application, about the risks of running the application when it goes live, and being able to automate those tasks and the messages between the groups and activities, being able to track the progress through the delivery and the execution and the operations and the management of the application, and then being able to quickly make changes on the journey. That's what brings success to an organization. By thinking ahead, by collaborating, by automating as much as we can, tracking and responding as quickly as possible. So surrounding the build activities, the development, the deployment, the operate, with the ability to collaborate, automate, and track. That's what we mean by trying to bring these different elements together and plan for failure and achieve success. So let's just take a moment to think about what delivery actually is. So, I mean, digital transformation is a great term around at the moment. It provides the opportunity to disrupt businesses and disrupt entire industries. And that's what the businesses want. And it requires a transformation in how the software is actually developed, delivered, and managed in order for the business to actually succeed. I mean, let's take a look at cloud as an example, right? So the business is likely to be aware of new technologies, containers, microservices, Kubernetes, and the business wants the IT group to modernize applications. And at the same time as that, they want the IT group to be reducing costs and increasing the speed of change so they can respond to the market. So now you've got to select the right tools to help the development teams to create new applications, to migrate existing ones over to cloud. You've got to select the right management solution for the applications modernized on the cloud. And you probably want to use AI to predict some of the issues, to resolve them before they start impacting end users, all at the same time whilst trying to reduce cost and increase the speed of delivery. Well, what could possibly go wrong when you're trying to understand the implications of all of those different elements, bring them together, introduce new technologies, and the business still wants us to deliver as quickly as possible and as reliably as possible? Well, to understand the potential points of failure, let's start with the end in mind and look at the journey of the transformation, which James will walk us through.
Okay, thanks, James. Yeah, so as you mentioned, keeping the end in mind is key, and it's really easy, especially in organizations that are structured in a way where you have different teams focused and with laser focus on a certain part of the life cycle or part of the application and the underlying services that support those applications. So for each step of the way, regardless of how early in the life cycle, from the development stages into the testing and deployment stages, to be able to think of the bigger picture and be able to collaborate in such a way that you're part of that bigger picture, you're not just part of one piece. All that seems obvious, but it's easier said than done in many situations. And so we've seen companies that are trying to overcome some of those barriers in different ways. Sometimes it's a cultural thing, sometimes it's a process thing, other times it's just a matter of having the right tools in place to enable that to happen. It starts really with planning and deploying. If you plan, as James said, with the end in mind, and you're going through each initial stage where you know what's out there in production today, as you embark on either an update or a new application or a new service, and you know what's going to be in store, of course, when you go to the point of migrating and testing, and so that your testing scenarios reflect as best as possible what's happening currently, not just in some scenario that was set months ago, but based on what's really going on, based on the issues that are at hand in the real world of production as you go through each stage. And those may change depending on what has changed in production itself. And you want to factor all those things in accordingly. So the best way to do that is to set up for yourselves a closed loop that is achievable and that helps you tap into the wealth of information based on what's failing, based on what's not going so well, but also what is going well. And that's where you start breaking down some of the barriers. And if you do it right, you don't overwhelm all the teams, you give them relevant information, but it's information that's going to help them at each stage for whatever their respective role might be. I guess, James, we could go to the next one. And so some of those barriers typically, right, are at each stage, right? And so being able to get beyond the barriers that are associated with each one, could be that if these barriers are in place, and many of us have experienced this, where you easily lose sight of what's going on over the next wall, or even 3 or 4 down the line. And you definitely, it really makes it a challenge to look at the entire big picture. So it starts, of course, with understanding the business requirements and not losing sight of why you're developing the apps that you are, or are updating whatever is under your control or under your portfolio, and then making sure that you're working hand in hand as it goes through the different phases. So being able to bridge across these inevitable barriers between the business supporting the application itself or sponsoring it, the development teams that need to understand clearly, of course, what those requirements are and why they're doing different updates, or why they're building new functionality. But then it doesn't stop there. And typically, depending on the culture of the organization, the throw it over the wall and let operations run with it kind of mentality is becoming more and more problematic, of course, but it's definitely not something that's desired, and people are much more cognizant now of the fact that that just doesn't work. It just makes everyone's life a lot harder. And if you have these barriers, and if you've experienced this, you know that it's real easy to lose sight of not only what's going on in production and how customers are experiencing what you've worked hard to create. It makes it hard to make improvements. It makes it hard to set priorities and make the right changes with confidence that you know that things are happening at each stage, whether it's all the way back to the business phases or the development phases. Knowing what's going on, what's working well, what's not, helps you understand the bigger picture in the context of the user's experience and your customer's experience, and really get a constructive way to get that kind of feedback. So it really boils down to understanding what could go wrong, what have we done to plan for that, and now what is going wrong once it's actually deployed. So James, I think we can move to the next one. So once you're in production, of course, it's easier said than done to be so prepared, right? It's almost futile to try to think, okay, well, we've developed the best application in the world. We've got failover. We've got a way to roll it back if things go wrong, and we've plotted out all the different scenarios through our testing, and we've tested. We've got the best testing team on earth, and we know exactly what might possibly go wrong, and we know what we'll do about it when it does. So we all know that that's not reality. The reality is you will have failures, you will have issues, regardless of how good you've done each part of the development and testing phase, and how well you've coordinated and been able to set up your deployment so that it's all in sync, and that all your teams are putting out things that are working well together or working well independently, and not straining any of the underlying infrastructure, underlying services. And so it starts with just knowing that you're going to have situations, you're going to have events that turn into incidents that need action, or they need some kind of attention, at least, whether it requires action or not. And being able to be ready and prepared for those things to happen is key. So it starts with knowing what types of sources of events might be a great place to be planning for, right? So if you're monitoring different parts of the application, different parts of the service, different parts of the infrastructure, if you manage that, if you've got different deployment tools that feed off either a failure event at any stage of the DevOps lifecycle, or could be just an informational type of what we would call an informational event, where it would say, all right, this build failed, or this build worked well, and you've got these 5 changes coming into production tomorrow. Those things are good to be able to just cast out a big net and reel them in and associate them with all things good and bad. And if you can do that, and you can do that in an automated and a very cohesive way, then you're not getting hit from all sides with alarm fatigue, or with different types of unknown or false alarms that people are chasing. And if your main focus is development, or your main focus is in the testing area, the last thing you want to get is either woken up in the middle of the night on a weekend, or even during the business day, a bunch of obscure, hard to understand sets of information that you're then tasked with figuring out, oh, what's going on with this? What's the problem? So planning ahead by pulling in the right information, correlating it in an automated way so that it's associated with a set of incidents that are easy to understand and have some context and have some relevance, and then sending out to the appropriate team members, regardless of how you're set up, to get the attention of the right people with the right set of information. And then not just giving them the awareness to know that there's an issue, know that there's an incident in their area of expertise or their area of responsibility, but to provide them some guidance and maybe some more context of what's been happening, such as a timeline of what's transpired over the last several hours that might be relevant to figuring out what the problem is, but also some guidance on what is likely the issue and what the steps are the last time something like this happened, or based on whatever information is able to be obtained from the different sources of events and associated with different types of incidents. You may even be able to provide guidance on, okay, this is a problem with this part of the application. It looks like it was due to either a recent build or something that was done from another team that didn't play well with what we just sent out. And it could be that you can have a set of guidance that are already guidelines and steps that are pre-prepared by your subject matter experts or your application owners that can help guide the people that are getting woken up in the middle of the night so they do the right thing, and it really reduces the potential to make a mistake or just chase the wrong thing. Those all help get to a much faster restoration of your service, a much faster resolution. And it really helps start that closed loop. So it brings in production to help put out the fires when they happen, of course, but it also helps you learn from doing. So if you're going to have this sets of information, you're going to help people restore service fast, well, you can learn from that experience. You could learn from what's going on, especially if you're able to identify trends of issues where things are having problems over time, and where people may be caught flat-footed in the middle of the night, where there isn't that kind of guidance that was provided from the application owner, and it's a gap that could be identified. And so these things can all happen, as a silver lining, if you will, or a good byproduct of the failures that you should inevitably expect. James, I think you could move on. And so just a quick illustration of that kind of thing happening in production. This is very simplified, but if you have all the events coming in from the left, and your teams are set with a way where they don't have to think about it anymore, they know if something's going on, they're going to get a list of incidents that are relevant to them. Of course, those need to come in multiple ways. Nobody's sitting in front of a console anymore. Some people might be, but most people aren't. Especially if you're on call, if you're a first responder, maybe your team operates under the mantra of you build the application, you test it, you deploy it, and then you own it. So if somebody breaks it, you don't have to break it and fix it. If somebody else breaks it or something else happens, or if one of the things you're dependent upon has an issue and it affects your application, you may be the one that's woken up in the middle of the night. So you want to know that you're getting information when that happens and your team is prepared overall. And if it's happening, it's not a false alarm, or it's a low chance of that at least, and that you're getting the right information that you can immediately either do some good detective work, get some traction on working with the team to fix it, or just taking care of it on your own. Or it could be that it's already it's something that's simple enough or happens on a repeated basis that you can just know that there's a set of automations in place where you could either initiate them or they're just going to happen, and you're just going to be mindful of it and watch it. So it starts with understanding that the incidents are happening because there are a bunch of events that are getting consolidated and correlated in an automated way. You're getting notified of it, and you'll see if it's just you and you're on the hook and you can take ownership of it, or maybe there's something where you've been asked to get engaged as a subject matter expert, and somebody else is looking for help from the team to collaborate. And there's different ways, of course, to communicate that. The key is to enable however your team is used to communicating, whether it's through some kind of chat or some kind of different methods such as just texting or through a mobile app of some sorts. It's really important that you continue to use those tools and expand on them and make it really easy so that people aren't missing things by just not paying attention or just not trying to get overwhelmed with all the different channels of communication that they could get, which makes it actually ironically easier to miss stuff. So you want that to happen. You want that to happen in a fluid way, and then the right information, of course, needs to get to them. And you want it to make it easy to escalate. It's not a bad thing to escalate. If there's an issue, an incident that's severe enough, it should be part of the planning of that failure. It should be part of the whole procedure that you want to welcome the escalation. You want to automate that where it makes sense. So if somebody's a heavy sleeper and they get woken up as a first responder that's on call and they don't wake up, they don't respond, or maybe they're just on vacation, you want that to either be set up to roll right over, or in the mishap that might happen. So you have a failure, and then you might have a failure on top of the failure where someone that's supposed to respond doesn't. So you want to just have that automatically roll into an escalation or to a coworker that's supposed to handle it. And then, of course, that when you want the escalation to happen, could be that there's something that requires more expertise or more drilled down. It could be that there's an authorization type of issue where the fix that's required really needs to go to an SRE or to another subject matter expert or to a different owner of the application. And then that's when the actions can take place. So there may be stages of guidance that are associated with each stage. So if you have someone that is a first responder and is only authorized to do so much, well, then you want that to be part of your guidance. You want to be part of the automation, if you have that built in, to roll into those SREs and subject matter experts. And then they can use, of course, and actually build run books for people to provide immediate action and immediate resolution and restoration of service type of action that can immediately go back into the beginning of the life cycle if needed. So this could be where the closed loop gets really systematic. So you can start seeing not only what people are doing and reacting to in the fray of a production issue, it becomes a data point. So you may have easy way then to identify, okay, here's what's working, here's what's not, but also to send that feedback loop back into the team that might have been responsible for the build that was having a problem, right? So rather than always roll things back, things are restored, but that information could go back to them and they can make some adjustments in an agile way. If you want to move on, James. So of course there's methods here that are age old that are still very relevant. And there's been a lot of discussion recently among the DevOps circles that I've seen where it's recommended that teams look at some of the age-old practices around operations management and bring that ops into the DevOps lifecycle and have that be something that is not necessarily rigid and doing things the same way that they've been done for decades, but to learn from that, to leverage some of those experiences, to leverage some of those methodologies, and definitely leverage the tools where they make sense. And of course, the tools have to be set up to be useful and have a good experience so that they don't become part of the problem. They become invisible, like a good referee in a good match, right? They're there to help you solve the problem. And so all those things have to be met. All those things are imperative, where they're there to help you expedite what's going on, understanding what's going on, help you expedite, of course, getting through that cycle that we illustrated of restoring service quickly, and then using that as data points and as sets of information to analyze, and then find ways to improve what's happening. So you're not looking at improving based on hypotheticals. You're looking at ways to improve based on what's really going well and what's really has some areas or needs of improvement. And that type of thing really helps bridge the gap between the ops teams and the development teams if you're split up that way. And if it's all one cohesive team, it really helps you get your head around the bigger picture. James, want to move forward? So I think where we want to hand it back is that DevOps overall, of course, is no longer optional. And what we want to make apparent and hopefully help teams that are embarking on DevOps methodologies at whatever stage you're in is that there are ways to achieve some of that closed loop. And I think I'll hand it back to you, James.
Sure, thanks, James. So yeah, just James is talking about there, that closed loop. Within IBM, our approach to DevOps is really built around 7 key aspects: think, code, deliver, run, manage, learn. But of course, fundamental at the heart of everything is the culture. I described earlier a couple of scenarios about the business wanting change, they've heard of cloud, they want to take advantage of those, and the IT team has to respond. And we talked about some of the actions and activities, but what really makes success is the collaboration, is the culture that drives this closed loop that James is talking about between the development team and the operational team as well. So James has been talking about the operations side, where we begin to respond to that. So let's look at the build-up to the task of operations that James was talking about. And the ability for operations to identify and resolve those issues that James was describing really start right at the beginning with the business requirements. And that's the agile development process that is evolving and then leads towards a successful, reliable release of the software. And then it's the plugging together of the capabilities that support all these different steps. That's called the delivery pipeline. So from a delivery perspective, from a development perspective, leading up to the execution of the operational tasks that James was talking about, that closed loop, is really made up of these 4 key areas: the collaborative development, continuous integration, continuous testing, and continuous delivery. So collaborative development is about how do we get architects communicating with the business stakeholders to understand the requirements and feeding into the development and the build team. It's also about understanding how do we configure and manage change within the execution of the software delivery. How do we reuse elements and introduce coding practices and collaborate. Continuous integration is about taking that code and then automating the build of that code, and then the testing and the test environment and the delivery of that software into whatever production and standby system that actually exists. Continuous testing is about automating the provision of the test environments, running up the services that are required, whether they're virtual or connecting to the real ones, looking at the data that is required and pulling that up, and then actually executing the test, both at the front end, at the back end, looking at the performance of the quality of the application, and then reusing some of that information, those test scripts and that information, in the operations team as well. So when we're monitoring, as James was describing, we're reusing assets and capabilities that have been developed within the development process. Continuous delivery is the automating of the release of the approved software, of that quality software, into the live environment, and then automatically initiating the monitoring activities for that particular application. So as James describes, this is the steps that build up into initiating the operations piece, and allowing that feedback and traceability back to understand what the issues are so we can respond as quickly as possible. So accelerating delivery is really focused on removing the bottlenecks from the development and the overall management pipeline. And also, as James was describing earlier, transformation is a journey, because we're going on a journey through the software, not through, it's certainly not a sprint, which is why we need tools to help us automate as much of this process as possible. So IBM has some capabilities in this area to walk through the journey of this software. So the rational product family, that focuses on the architecture, development, the configuration and change management, and the testing of the actual software itself that's being produced. The Open Code family integrates with rational tools to support the build of the software, the delivery into the different environments, and then the release of the software that's been created using those rational tools. IBM Cloud Application Management, Performance Management, monitors the software that's just been released by Open Code, and monitors for the performance, the availability, and the response times. And then the Cloud Event Management capability, that automatically correlates the events into prioritized incident views. And that notifies the right people, as James was describing, at the right time to keep everyone in the entire delivery lifecycle in sync, and so those incidents can be resolved as quickly as possible. And then IBM Velocity, that coordinates across the end-to-end pipeline, across the development activities and the operation activities, and it's used to track the value of our delivery process and identifies the delivery bottlenecks that's disrupting that flow of the software from the requirements through the development, through the deployment, through the testing, the release, monitoring, and then the feedback loops it's as well. So overall, within IBM, we refer to this approach as the secure enterprise DevOps at scale. And it's the combination of these technologies that solve the problem that we've been talking about, this closed loop. So let's look at the value of this, though, in the real world. Well, that's what people want to hear about, that work in the real world. So a couple of examples. Rabobank's a great company, and they've got what they call a radical automation initiative. It's really focused on the automation of this entire delivery process. For instance, as part of that activity, they were looking at the handover points from the developer to an operations engineer. And they found that those were just a source of waste of time. There were lots of steps that were repeated, that were being redone by the operations team, that had been done by the development team, and in the feedback loop, vice versa as well. So when the integration and the automation were brought into the IT process, those handover points were eliminated. And that increased the quality of the service, reduced the costs, and allowed the teams to be more confident around the software that's actually being released. So one example of that, and particularly in this theme of succeeding by planning for failure, is around the use of the test data itself. James talked about the importance of testing. You can do lots of testing, but you've got to understand how you're going to respond later on. And one of the great ways to do that is by looking at the test data. And Rabobank's teams, they took an approach where they decided they have to use data which is as close as possible to production during the testing phase. So when they go live, they can be confident of what the service is actually going to do, how the application is going to respond, and the different approaches that they could take to resolve problems can be simulated and executed as appropriately as possible. And so the operations team and the development team work together and to decide how can they identify and use data that was as accurate as possible. The dev team were using simulated data and things like that. And the operations, of course, have to deal with the live data. So they're now using pseudonymized data and working together to identify that. And the dev team are using the pseudonymized data from the live environment. And that, they're finding, is unleashing a whole load of new innovations from the complete DevOps team. It's bringing more security, more innovation into what they're doing. And that, of course, is resulting in benefits to their end clients. Fidelity, another great company, they've been using IBM technology. for a long time. They went through a similar approach, looking at how they can improve and optimize this closed loop process that James was talking about earlier on. And they've gone through the same assessment process, and using our technology, they're now, their delivery process has been fully automated. So applications that used to take days to release now just take an hour. And so they're able to respond much more quickly with changes when problems occur, whether that's bugs or new capabilities, whatever. They can respond much more quickly and get that out to their customers with the benefits to the organization. So an important point here is that we've been talking about operations, we've been talking about development around some of the examples we've used. We talked about cloud, we've talked about some real customers, but failure doesn't stop, right? We can prepare for the technology that we have today, particularly around recent evolutions like the use of cloud that we talked about, application modernization, the use of APIs and services. But from an IBM perspective, we're also continuing to think about what's coming down the line, what's coming in the future, to say how do the approaches and the technology that we're supporting and providing today to address the problem with recent evolutions in technology, how are those going to continue to be applicable going forward in the future? How can we predict what the potential failures are? So we're talking about cloud, we've got technologies that are happening now like blockchain, which is beginning to disrupt complex supply chains and bringing more secure flow of information and attributed information into those particular supply chains. And there are cutting edge technologies like the crypto anchors, things like tiny computers that are tied into assets and real elements that tie themselves into execution across through a blockchain. And it becomes a new powerful way to prove the authenticity of assets within a supply chain. So a new way to optimize that supply chain, which businesses are looking at to try and give themselves a competitive advantage, to reduce costs, and they're expecting the IT groups now to be looking at how do they address that. And then there's more future-looking technology, which businesses are interested in utilizing, things like quantum computing. So it's a rapidly emerging technology. It's beginning to be used by a whole new set of professionals and developers, looking at how do they utilize the speed and how do they process information using the principles of quantum mechanics, which are going to change the way that they respond to the supply chains. So we start thinking about how do we combine all these together. We're trying to evolve right now applications to utilize cloud. We're trying to think about how do we disrupt the industry by utilizing blockchain technology in our supply chains. And we're trying to prepare ourselves for the future and utilizing quantum computing. The business wants us to transform the industry, disrupt the industry, and they're looking at IT to deliver that. So what could possibly go wrong, right? It's not just making changes to their technology to support today's technology changes and trends. We're trying to look at what's coming down the line as well and making sure the technology is applicable for them as well. So IBM can help you succeed by planning for failure for all technologies now and in the future, and from a planning perspective for when those applications go live, whichever technology they happen to be using. And there are two key components to be considering. First is the delivering of reliable software as quickly as possible. So this involves changing that developer experience, getting them more collaborative, working more collaboratively with the business and with the end user as well, thinking about operations right at the beginning, starting with the end in mind. Then there's the accelerating the actual development and delivery process itself, embracing new technologies with cloud, blockchain, and elsewhere as well. But it's also about shifting operations left as much as possible, bringing the operations thinking and planning into the development process and the delivery processes, and then applying insights, tracking the trend across that lifecycle and removing bottlenecks. The second is identifying, resolving problems as quickly as possible, using things like real-time analytics, predictive insights around anticipating what's going to happen and what can be done, and cognitively enhancing that workflow. So using technology to make decisions to help augment our ability to resolve problems as quickly as possible. And IBM's got a unique solution, and it's helping customers around the world to resolve those changes. So we've been talking about planning for success, achieving success by planning for failure. And we looked at different technologies and approaches to do that. What we would suggest and ask you guys to do, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can request a no-charge assessment by following the link on this slide. I think information is going to be available. You can take a look at more information on our website, watch some videos to see some of the technology in action. Feel free to reach out to either of the Jameses, myself or Mr. Moore, through LinkedIn. We're always open to your questions and your opinion as well, because we know that the execution of the approaches that we've been talking about are difficult, but the results, when it works right, can be significant for the business and the organization. So Charlene, I think we're going to move on to some questions, if there are any, from the audience today.
Yeah, okay, great. We'll go ahead and look at the audience questions. If you have a question for either of the Jameses, please go ahead and use your control panel and submit your questions. We do have plenty of time for them. We've gotten one or two in so far, so we'll start with those. How does IBM DevOps tool stack compare with competitors in terms of industry adoption and customer base and total cost of ownership? Are you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly, James. But maybe I go first, James. Then you can talk as well from the ops side as well. But one point I'd just like to talk about that is the way the market is assessing DevOps technologies and the way the analysts are looking at DevOps technologies is predominantly by their categorization. So we talked earlier on about different steps that make up the delivery side, for example, about continuous deployment, continuous development, continuous testing, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and so on. And from an analyst perspective, the analysts tend to look at those as segmented assessments, looking at best capabilities in class for each part of the DevOps lifecycle. There are some, of course, which talk about DevOps in its entirety, but most of the assessments look at the key areas. So by looking at the analyst reports is a good way to get an assessment across the market to see how these technologies compare. And I've been is a leader. I've been rating leader on the delivery side in all these categories by multiple analysts for quite some time. Now there are some reports that differ, of course, every now and again. But on the whole, looking across the analysts is a good way to get an assessment of how the IBM tool stack compares against some of the competitors in the market. Other areas from adoption, we have our Think conference coming up in February of next year, and Think is a great opportunity for people to hear directly from customers. We are continuing to increase the number of customers sessions, customer stories at Think, compared to IBM is just talking about technology as well. We'll still have those, but it's a great opportunity to watch online if you can't attend in person. If you can attend in person, then listen to the customers directly and hear about the great successes they're having as well. James, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so that's a good summary. The only thing I'll add to that, James, is that there are a lot more choices and options that IBM provides now. So depending on what situation is best or what situation you're in, there should be an option in the set of tools that are flexible in the way that they can be adopted, in the way that they could be deployed, and there's varying levels of cost of ownership, of course, as well, depending on what your situation is, how complex of an environment you have. There's a way to take advantage of some of the newer options, along with some of the things that have been around for quite some time and are very mature. And you have a choice, right? If your organization is looking to lighten its footprint and put as much as possible as makes sense into a public cloud situation, so that you're managing workloads that are in a public cloud setting, and you want to do the management of them from the public cloud as well, you have that option now. If you're one of the organizations where that just doesn't work, whether due to either procedural issues or regulatory issues, whatever it might be, and you need to keep everything behind your firewall, or at least a good portion of it, and certain parts of this overall life cycle that we've been talking about doesn't make sense to do in a public cloud setting, well then of course we allow or provide a way to deploy cloud native type of technologies, but behind your firewall. And then that's in addition to some of the traditional things that we've been able to provide. So depending on where you're starting and what kind of objectives you have, there should be a set of paths and tools that you can put in place that meet those objectives, and especially from a cost of ownership, it helps you optimize the best costs and the best bang for your money.
Okay. Awesome. All right, great. So next question. What are some ways you are seeing DevOps teams preparing for and responding to application failures in production?
Okay, so I'll take that one, James, and you can add to it, of course. I think some of the things that you may have heard me mention are some of the most prevalent. So automating where it makes sense. So automating the notification, but only doing that in a way that's creating awareness and promoting more responsiveness to the right people that should be getting that communication with the set of information that's relevant. So you don't want to get alarm fatigue or notification fatigue as a result, and enabling your teams to filter that out easily is the key to keeping away from doing that. And then automating the associating what you can anticipate. So there's lots of things we can anticipate that are going to happen, especially if you're fixing an issue that already was pre-existing, right? And so if you've planned ahead, whether you're on the development side or the ops side, and you know that, okay, if somebody's going to get woken up in the middle of the night, I can empathize. We're all part of that. We all take our turn. And I'm the expert in this change that's happening or this new set of functions that's being built into an application. Provide some guidance to the team and make it systematically capture it in the form of a run book or maybe some automated steps so that they can do some point and click to do some either diagnosis or investigation or even resolution action so that they don't have to worry about doing the wrong thing or waking someone else up because they don't feel confident in taking the right action. So doing that level of automation is something that we're seeing happen. It's a carryover really to what was happening for years, and it's just being applied to different types of workloads, to different types of platforms, and different types of applications and application rollouts on a continuous basis. So to support that continuous delivery, you really have to get to that level of automation.
All right, great. Next question. How can development teams and operations-focused teams improve applications and operational service levels if they are stuck taking care of operational failures?
Yeah, so that's where, okay, if I'm if I'm putting out fires all the time, how can I actually make an improvement, or how can I actually keep the funnel flowing of all the new deployments that I have? And I think some of that, as I just mentioned, it comes into play from automating. But the other piece of it is really to work together and learn by doing, right? Learn by what's happening in production, learn what's happening at each stage of the DevOps lifecycle. Because each failure, each incident can turn into an opportunity to learn, right? So it could be that it identifies where there might be some underlying service weak spots that are just not supporting all the different workloads that are coming out. It could be that there's something that was changed to an application that all of a sudden, it could be a chronic thing where, it could be a sudden where it's just all kinds of failures happen right away, or it could be more of a chronic thing that's harder to pick up on, it's harder to notice. And things like that are opportunities where failure can turn into a learning opportunity. So taking advantage of that, planning for that, knowing that if you do it right, yeah, you're gonna have to put out fires, but that's going to be a way that turns into ways that you can help improve. So you're not just constantly chasing the different issues that are happening. You're doing them in a constructive way that knowing that that's going to actually help you get to the point where those incidents don't happen anymore, or it helps you prepare for the new ones that might come down the line that you just can't anticipate.
I said to that, it's also an interesting question about culture, isn't it? That at some point you have to take a step back to say we've got to invest to improve the future rather than continuing to react to the immediate pressures as well. And that's what in the example I talked about earlier, Rabobank, for example, where they put this radical automation approach, radical change approach in place. They took a step back and said, how do we improve from the bottom up? Go back to the beginning, but think we'll start with the end in mind. if you like, think how can we improve that closed approach? So organizations do need to take that step back to realize that the full value of that, because it does take a little bit of thinking. You know, there are cultures at the heart of a lot of this, getting the collaboration parts going as well as looking at the execution parts as well. So it's very important to look at take that step back and utilize the new technologies, cognitive capabilities embedded within the DevOps approach as well. Begin to make sense.
Okay, great. Just want to remind the audience, there's still time. If you have a question for either of the James or both of them, go ahead and use your control panel and submit your questions. Next question, are your testing teams under constant pressure to keep up with ever increasing agile demands?
So I'll take that one. So are your testing teams, yeah.
Yeah. Next question. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, they certainly are. But what is interesting is the amount of change, the type of change that comes through. So the business is requesting changes to react to the market. There are technology changes coming from the different vendors that provide the tools and the platforms that people get used. You've got people at IBM doing research, bringing out new technologies that change the way that people can think. And then there's new approaches entirely, like blockchain's approach, which is somewhat vendor neutral in terms of its approach, but the execution, of course, can be supported by different vendors as well. So testers are under a lot of pressure. But the question also talks about the agile part of testing, which is the connection of the testers to those businesses and having those discussions. And that's really key, because it's about getting testers involved much earlier in the life cycle. In the same way as operations, we need to think about shifting left, the executions and activities, and think about planning for failures much earlier in the life cycle. The same applies from a test perspective during the development and the delivery process as well. But shifting testing to the left as much as possible and getting those collaboration and those engagements going earlier. Introducing automated testing much earlier in the life cycle, using virtualized services and so on to simulate environments. Begin to allow those teams to start absorbing more of those requests from the business and from the technology and from the vendors and from the research organizations that are happening around the world as well. So in a similar manner, taking a step back to think how can we improve the approach to testing allows those testing teams to respond to the ever increasing demand on their time from the business.
All right, great. Next question here. Are you looking for ways to streamline, automate, or lower the cost of testing? I'm not sure how that one is going to work, but
yeah, so let me take that one, and it kind of builds on what I was just talking a moment ago, really, about shifting testing left. It's all about quality and resolving issues and problems as quickly as possible. So when we get into operations, when the monitoring tools are doing their job and they predict something's going to go wrong, that's a cost to the business and to the organization. So really, we want to be in a position where there are as few problems occurring in live as possible, and that's down to the quality of not just the application, but the entire environment upon which that application depends, the services that it uses, the infrastructure that it runs on, and so on. So that means testing needs to occur more frequently. Testing connect to operations as well. Data that the environment are as accurate as possible to the live environment, or as close as possible. And operation activities need to be able to reuse testing assets and activities as well, so they can assess impacts and predict problems that are coming down the line. So, given all of those changes, there's continuous work to improve the process of assessing quality throughout the delivery life cycle, and that comes from not just the execution of the tests, but how you collaborate that the value of testing and quality through development, the requirements, the operations, and the development as well. So So the answer is yes, but there's a lot being done around that.
All right, great. Okay, well, that is all the questions that we have. I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. And James want to thank the both of you for answering the questions. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of the webinar, you will be able to access it on demand. We should, later on this afternoon, should be sending out a link via email to everybody who registered so that they can access the webinar at their leisure. Also, the webinar is going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always head over there, look under webinars on demand, and it should be there waiting for you. While you're there, I also want to remind you that we have tons of other great webinars listed on the site. So hopefully while you're poking around looking for this one, there'll be one or two other that pique your interest. James Moore and James Hunter, thank you both for joining me today and giving such a great webinar as always. So thanks again, I appreciate it. And also thank you to the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, the moderator, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody.